They say no man is an island. I was for 204 days. And something was on that island with me. It's funny, isn't it? How a man can spend his whole life craving one thing, get it, and then spend the rest of his life trying to claw his way back. My one thing was silence. True, honest to God silence. The kind you can't get in the city, with its endless symphony of sirens, car alarms, and the indescribable feeling of millions of lives pressing in on you from all sides. I worked as a data analyst in a grey cubicle under flickering fluorescent lights, staring at spreadsheets until the numbers swam behind my eyelids at night. The highlight of my day was the 15-minute walk to the tube station, where I could at least feel the rain on my face. I was drowning, not in water, but in noise and people and expectation. So, when the ad popped up on some obscure job-seeking website, it felt less like an opportunity and more like a life raft. It was posted by something called the St. Jude's Historical Preservation Society. A bit stuffy, but the offer was anything but. They needed a guardian for a Grade 2 listed property on the remote Isle of Dawn, somewhere off the jagged northern coast of Scotland. A 1-year contract. All provisions supplied. Years' worth of non-perishables. A diesel generator with enough fuel to power a small town. Satellite internet for emergencies. And a small flock of hardy goats to look after. The pay was a hefty lump sum, enough to buy a small house outright when I got back. The catch? There was only one. Under no circumstances was I to leave the island for the duration of the contract. 1 full year of total, uninterrupted solitude. To me, it wasn't a catch. It was the whole damn point. I signed the online paperwork so fast, I nearly broke my mouse. 2 weeks later, a grizzled fisherman named Finn was hauling me and my 2 duffel bags across a slate-grey sea. The island rose from the mist like a monstrous green tooth, crowned by a single, formidable stone structure. The Bastion, Finn called it. "She's a lonely place, lad," he'd shouted over the roar of the engine, his face a road map of wrinkles carved by sea and wind. "Some places are best left forgotten." I just grinned, the salt spray on my face feeling like a baptism. "Sounds like heaven to me, Finn." He just shook his head and spat into the churning water. The first 3 months were heaven. The silence I'd craved was absolute, broken only by the bleating of the goats, the cry of the gulls, and the eternal, rhythmic crash of waves against the cliffs. I fell into a simple, monastic routine. Wake at sunrise, feed the goats, check the generator, walk the perimeter of the small island, a journey that took less than an hour. Read, write, stare at the sea. The bastion itself was enormous. A labyrinth of cold stone corridors, echoing halls, and dust-sheeted rooms. I lived in the small, modernised keeper's quarters in the west wing. The rest of the building was locked and shuttered. It was more than enough. The overwhelming pressure in my chest, the constant thrum of anxiety that had been my companion for a decade, simply dissolved. I felt clean. But paradise, as they say, has a short shelf life. By month 5, The blissful silence had begun to curdle. It started to feel aggressive somehow. The lack of another human voice began to grate on me. I started talking to the goats, giving them names like Boudica and Attila. I'd have long, one-sided conversations with them while mucking out their barn, and their blank, chewing stares started to feel less like animal indifference and more like silent judgment. The walks became chores. The books became boring. The endless sea began to look like the walls of a prison, not a canvas of freedom. Boredom is a strange acid. It dissolves routine and reason, leaving behind a raw, itching curiosity. My attention turned to the one thing I hadn't yet explored: the history of the bastion itself. The St. Jude Society had left a small archive in a locked study off the main hall. It took me a day to pick the lock with a couple of paper clips, my heart thumping with a childish, transgressive thrill. The room smelled of paper decay and stagnant air, with filing cabinets lining one wall. I pulled open a drawer labelled Archival 1880 to 1920. That's when I learned that the bastion wasn't built as a stately home or a military fort. St. Jude's wasn't the name of a saint. It was the St. Jude's Asylum for the morally and mentally afflicted. And the people they housed here weren't just melancholics or hysterics. They were the ones deemed too dangerous, too depraved for mainland society. The serial poisoners, the child killers, the prophets of bloody, forgotten gods, the ones who made other madmen look sane. The photographs were the worst. Brittle, sepia-toned squares of human misery. Men and women in coarse canvas uniforms, some shackled to walls. Their eyes, God, their eyes were either hollowed out pits of despair or blazing with a terrifying, ecstatic light. And the grins, so many of them were grinning. Wide, impossibly stretched smiles that didn't touch their eyes. They looked like they knew a secret, a terrible, cosmic joke, and they were desperate for you to be in on it. I found the chief physician's journals, a man named Dr. Alistair Potter. His early entries were clinical, detached, and filled with talk of phrenology and pioneering electroshock treatments. He wrote about a new experimental therapy he'd devised, sympathetic resonance therapy. He believed that extreme madness wasn't a flaw in the brain's chemistry, but rather the brain tuning into a frequency outside of normal human perception. His goal wasn't to cure them, but to isolate this frequency, to understand it. He'd built some kind of device in the asylum's lower levels. As the years in the journals passed, Potter's scientific prose frayed, replaced by something wild and fearful. He wrote of patients screaming in unison when there was no audible sound. He described them scratching patterns into the stone walls of their cells. Patterns he began to see in the flight of birds and the erosion on the cliffs. His last entry was almost impossible to read. They're not receiving. They've become transmitters. The silence here is not empty. It is listening. We opened a door, and I fear we've let the silence in. The day after I read that, the goats went strange. I went to the barn in the morning, and I found all 7 of them huddled in the far corner, pressed together, stock still. They weren't eating. They were all just staring. Staring at the stone wall of the barn, their weird rectangular pupils blown wide. Nothing I did could get them to move. It was as though something I couldn't see was standing right there, and they were terrified of it. That was the point where the unease, the kind that tickles the back of your neck, became a cold, hard knot of fear in my gut. The silence wasn't peaceful anymore. It was watchful. I'd walk the corridors of the keeper's quarters and feel a static charge in the air. The sense that I'd just missed seeing someone duck out of a doorway. Potter's journal had contained a map, a detailed architectural drawing of the bastion. Most of it was familiar, but one part was new. A section on the lowest level, labelled Sub-Level C, Quarantine and Expulsion. It showed a long, narrow corridor leading from the asylum's medical wing to a small, concealed exit on the far side of the island, built into the cliff face. A bolt hole, an escape route for the guards, just in case the inmates ever truly took over. The idea lodged in my brain like a fishhook. I had to find it. Not just because I was bored, but because some primal part of me screamed that I needed to know there was another way out. The main dock was on the east side, but this map showed an exit on the west, a place I'd never explored thoroughly. It took me 4 days. The western cliff face was a sheer drop, battered by the worst of the Atlantic winds, and overgrown with a century's worth of thick, thorny ivy. I abseiled down with a rope from the goat pen, hacking away at the vegetation with a machete from the tool shed. My hands were raw and bleeding by the time I found it. A slab of iron, painted to look like the surrounding rock. So perfectly camouflaged, I'd almost missed it. A simple, rusted ring served as a handle. It took all of my weight to pull it open. The groan of the hinges was a sound of protest from a tomb that hadn't been disturbed in 100 years. The air that billowed out was foul. I was almost hyperventilating due to the adrenaline coursing through my veins. Every instinct told me to slam the door shut, climb the rope, and pretend I'd never found it. But I couldn't. I had to know what Potter was so afraid of. I had to know what the silence was hiding. With a powerful torch in hand, I stepped inside. The tunnel was narrow and slick with moisture, sloping gently downwards into the heart of the island. The iron door slammed shut behind me with a deafening boom, plunging me into absolute darkness, save for the dancing beam of my light. All I could hear was the odd drip of water and my own breathing. I walked for what felt like an eternity. The only sound, the squelch of my boots on the slimy stone. The tunnel opened into a wide corridor. Sub-level C. The air was colder here, the metallic smell stronger. There were doors on either side, heavy iron things with small barred windows. Cells. I shone my torch into the first one. It was a bare stone box, 6 feet by 9. On the far wall, gouged into the stone with what must have been fingernails, was a spiral pattern, drawn over and over again. Inside the spiral, a single, frantically scratched phrase. It hears our thoughts. My blood ran cold. I backed away, moving my light to the next cell. More scratches. Scrawled faces, with those same terrifying, wide-mouthed grins from the photographs. And words. Gibberish mostly. But then, I saw a phrase that made me stumble backward. Simon is here. Simon is afraid. That was my name. Panic seized me, sharp and electric. It wasn't possible. This place had been sealed for a century. I was alone. It had to be a coincidence. Simon's a very common name. I forced myself to breathe, my breath pluming in the frigid air. Get a grip, man. You're just scaring yourself. I pushed on, deeper down the corridor. At the end was a large double-doored room. A small brass plaque on the door read, Sympathetic Resonance Chamber. Potter's Laboratory. The room was circular, like a small arena. In the centre was a single, terrifying chair. It looked like an electric chair's crueler, more complex cousin. Festooned with thick leather straps, wires, and a bizarre helmet-like contraption, bristling with copper antennae, and what looked like tuning forks of various sizes. The chair was pointed towards a vast concave dish of polished copper that took up an entire wall, like a giant ear aimed at the heart of the earth. Instruments and gauges, their glass long since shattered, littered the control consoles around the room's perimeter. This was it. This was where Potter had conducted his experiments. He hadn't just been listening to his patients' brains. He'd been using them as amplifiers, pointing their combined madness at something else entirely, trying to tune in to that frequency. I walked towards the central chair, the beam of my torch dancing over its grotesque form. A fine layer of dust covered everything, undisturbed for decades. But as my light passed over the floor in front of the chair, I saw something that made my heart stop dead. Footprints. Bare footprints in the thick dust. They weren't old or fossilized. They were fresh. The dust was disturbed. And they weren't leading out of the room. They were leading into it, from the far, dark side. And they stopped in a neat, parallel pair, right behind the resonance chair, as if someone was standing there, in the dark, watching me. I spun around, moving my torch from side to side, up and down. Nothing. Just shadows and dead machinery. But the feeling, it's almost impossible to describe. It was 1,000 times more intense than anything I'd felt upstairs. A crushing weight of observation. I wasn't alone in the room. Then, all of a sudden, I heard a whisper in the air. It was faint, and it seemed to come from everywhere at once. It wasn't in English, or any language I knew. It was a chittering, liquid sound. A string of wet consonants and long, sighing vowels. But I understood it. Not with my ears, but directly in my mind. The meaning blooming like a black flower in the center of my thoughts. Lonely. I started backing away, my feet clumsy with terror. The whispering grew louder, weaving itself around a new sound, an invasive vibration. It was coming from the giant copper dish. a deep thrumming that resonated through the soles of my boots and up into my bones. So very lonely. The voice was changing now. The inhuman chittering was smoothing out, coalescing. It was trying to form a word it knew, a word it had heard, a name, my name. It was my own voice. Not just my voice, but a perfect imitation of my own internal monologue. That quiet voice in your head that you think is yours alone. It spoke my name with my own inflection, my own private cadence. It had been listening the whole time. Not just to the goats, not just to the wind, to me, to my thoughts. It hears our thoughts. That broke me. Primal, unreasoning terror took over. So I turned and ran. I didn't care about the dark, the slippery floor, anything. I just ran. Behind me, the resonance intensified into a deafening roar, and the whisper became a scream. A chorus of voices, the mad and the damned, all screaming one word. Stay. I scrambled through the tunnel, my torch bouncing wildly, painting nightmarish images on the wet rock. I could feel it behind me, not chasing, but reaching out to me. A psychic pressure against the back of my skull, trying to get in, trying to make me turn around, trying to make me one of its voices. I burst through the iron door into the grey, windswept daylight, gasping and sobbing. I didn't stop to close it. I scrambled up the rope, my bloody hands screaming in protest, and ran. I ran past the barn, where the goats were now bleating in sheer terror, past the silent, imposing mass of the bastion, and straight to the keeper's quarters. I went directly to the satellite radio. My contract be damned. My sanity was draining away, like sand through a sieve. My hands were shaking so violently, it took me 3 tries to key the microphone. When the Coast Guard dispatcher answered, I didn't tell him about whispers or footprints in the dust. I told him the generator had exploded, that I had severe burns and needed immediate evacuation. I lied through my teeth. My voice was a ragged, desperate thing. Finn came to get me. The look on his face when he saw me said he knew I wasn't burned. He saw the stark, raving madness in my eyes. He didn't say a word on the trip back. He just handed me a flask of whiskey and kept his eyes on the horizon. As the Isle of Dawn shrank behind us, becoming that green tooth once more, I could have sworn I saw something on the western cliffs. A dark shape, standing where the hidden door was. A shape that looked unnervingly like me. I never got my payout. The St. Jude Society claimed I broke the contract. I didn't care. I'm back in the city now. I live in a tiny apartment above a noisy bar, and I've never been so grateful for the sound of sirens and traffic in my life. I can't stand the quiet now. If it gets too quiet, I start to hear that whisper at the edge of my hearing. I start to feel my mind unraveling, strand by strand. So please, I'm begging you, if you ever see an ad for a job on a remote Scottish island, If you ever hear stories of a place called the Isle of Dawn, turn and walk away. Don't go looking for it. Some places are best left forgotten, because what's forgotten doesn't always stay that way. What was woken up in that asylum is still there. It's trapped and it's lonely. And for 6 months, it did nothing but listen to the mind of a modern man. It learned about cars and the internet and airplanes and the billions of people packed onto this planet. It spent all that time listening to my thoughts, my memories, my fears. It learned all about the world outside that island from inside my head. So tell me, if a door that was opened can never truly be closed, what terrible things could it do with all of that information?